I think the most important part of a laundry room is the countertops. Is that weird? I mean, most people would probably say the washer, the dryer, the storage, or the clothes drying rack, but nope, not me. I'm about the countertops. When we moved into our garage apartment, there was nowhere to put one except for over the washer and dryer, and since the washer was a top load, that wasn't even an option. Sad day. But when I recently remodeled this space, we decided to make the switch to a front load, and I immediately started building that countertop. I made it from simple 2x material, but I wanted it to look like a butcher block with lots of thin pieces glued together because, you know, I just like making things difficult. So if you're ready to see how I made this butcher block style countertop and how you can make your own, keep watching. Then head over to the blog post linked below for more details and the full tutorial. For this countertop, I used 2x10 yellow pine. This is just going in my laundry room for folding clothes, so I opted for a cost-effective option like this pine. However, if you plan to cut on this or you want something a little nicer, you could opt for a hardwood like maple. The process is still the same. I started out by measuring the space that I wanted the countertop to stretch between and how deep I wanted the countertop to be. Based on the space, I needed a top that was about 6.5 feet long and about 30 inches deep. From that, I determined the amount of lumber that I would need. I ended up purchasing 4 2x10 boards from the Home Depot, and that gave me slightly more than I needed. I ran them through the planer to get them cleaned up and to make sure that they were all the same thickness. This step is optional, but it does save time on sanding later. Then I cut them down on my miter saw to make them easier to trim into thinner strips on the table saw. If you didn't want to make it look like butcher block and you were okay with wider boards, they'll be easier to glue together without cutting them down first. But I like the butcher block, so I cut 2 of my boards in half and the other 2 into 5 foot and 3 foot pieces just to give some variation when I'm gluing them up. I took these boards over to the table saw and squared up one side by shaving about 1/8 of an inch off, then cut them all down to 1.5 inch strips to make 2x2s. Note that you could just use 2x2s instead of cutting down 2x10s, but I just prefer making my own 2x2s. The glue up was stressful, I will not lie, but I found it much easier to glue up in sections of 5 runs at a time. So I laid out my clamps and arranged 5 rows of 2x2s how I wanted across the clamps, making sure that 1, my butt joints didn't all line up in the middle, so I staggered them, and 2, I left myself enough room to trim off the ends so that my final length would still be long enough. Then I applied glue to the edges and to the butt joints and clamped tightly. It's important to get everything as flat as possible to make the sanding process later less painful. Once that glue up was dry, I unclamped and glued up the next 5 rows, and then I clamped it all back up again. I did this 5 rows at a time until I got the final width I needed, which is about 30 inches. It took a couple of days. 1 glue up after work, 1 glue up before bed, repeat the next day. But once everything was finally glued up, I trimmed down the length to the exact size I needed to stretch wall to wall in my laundry nook. Using a square and a Kreg AccuCut, I trimmed one side down with my circular saw. Then I measured from that end to where the cut on the other side needed to be and then cut that as well. The next step is sanding. It was a long process, but I used a belt sander and an orbital sander to get the countertop as flat as possible. It probably would have been easier to glue up this countertop in sections of 5 runs, then run those through the planer, then glue them together instead of gluing so many individual boards, but hindsight's 20/20 and this ended up working fine, it just took a little bit longer. I'll be leaning over this top pretty often to access the upper cabinet over my washer and dryer, so I didn't want a super sharp corner. So I used my new rigid 1/2 inch router and a Diablo 30-degree chamfer bit to give this countertop a nice chamfered edge along the front. I've got a rigid 1/4 inch trim router as well, but I've been wanting something with a little more power for deeper cuts on thicker materials, and this rigid 1/2 inch router didn't disappoint. And a Diablo 1/2 inch 30-degree chamfer was my first bit choice since it's my favorite edge to route. Once the top was finished, I was ready to install it. First, I determined the height of my new washer and dryer to make sure I left enough room for them to slide underneath. Then I located the studs along the walls where the countertop was going and marked a line along the walls where the bottom of the top needed to sit. I used 2.5-inch wood screws to screw 2x2 and 2x4 scraps into the studs right at the line I marked for the counter height. I made sure everything was level side to side, then screwed them in, and I attached one on each side of the nook and then placed one along the back wall. We slid the countertop into place on top of these supports and checked that everything was level, and of course it wasn't, so I ended up making a few adjustments to my supports to get it all level, but it wasn't too bad. At this point, you could screw the top into the supports to hold it in place, but we wanted to be able to remove the top quickly in case we needed to access the shutoffs, so I didn't screw it in. It's heavy enough, it should stay put on its own. I installed the washer and dryer, slid my laundry hamper in place, and gave it a couple coats of poly to protect and seal it, and then it was finished. Because my washer water access was so high, I ended up having to raise the top a couple of inches above my washer and dryer to clear the water access hole. I wasn't a huge fan of this big gap, so I cut a strip of 1x2 and glued it onto the bottom of the countertop like shown. This is optional, but I think it looks a little bit better to cover up that gap. Ideally, you wouldn't have a gap, but if you have a similar situation to where your water access is so high, just like me, that's how you can fix it. And now I've got a pretty nice surface to fold my laundry on. It's life-changing, you guys. Life-changing. I made life a little more difficult by making this more of a butcher block style versus wider boards, but I really like the variation here. To each his own, I didn't mind the extra work. If you haven't already checked out my whole transformation and laundry nook refresh, be sure to check out that video and that blog post as well, and stay tuned for details on how I built the cabinets and tiled the backsplash coming very soon. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe to my channel, and if you like this video, I'd love it if you'd give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments below. Until next time, friends, happy building!